Ferrari enthusiasts know that Enzo's true passion was always his race cars, and the street cars were simply a means to an end for the Ferrari founder. However, by the late 50s, road car production became vitally important to the company's future, and so the 250, Ferrari's first mass-produced model, was born. With over 52 years in the business, my dad has definitely seen his fair share of awesome Ferraris, but his very first Ferrari was a PF Coupe, much like this one, so he wanted to share some fun stories about the car.
This car, PF Coupe serial number 1315, certainly brings back memories. As Colleen says, my first Ferrari was a PF Coupe, serial number 1447. And it's fun to put everything into perspective then and relate it today. At that time, my main car was a 57 Corvette I'd paid a staggering $500 for. The Corvette was certainly faster than the Ferrari, but the Ferrari was a whole different world. When I bought 1447, the twin to this, I paid $2,000, and it ran, it drove, it did everything right. It killed a lot of mosquitoes thanks to the fact they don't have valve stem guides. But it was really fun to drive. The Ferrari was simply a whole different level of driving experience than the Corvette. Again, the Corvette was faster in a straight line, but the Ferrari was just a whole different world. The way the transmission went through the gears, the way the clutch was very light, the steering's very light, very responsive for the time. It's also interesting to put the performance in perspective. This is now an old classic car. When I bought my PF Coupe in 1972, was a 13-year-old Ferrari, and that would be roughly the equivalent today of buying a used 210 599. So think of this in its day as the 599 of the late 50s and very early 60s.
The 250s were definitely Ferrari's first production model, and this is a PF Coupe, but the first kind of production cars started with the Europa. They made about 20 altogether, so very limited mass production cars. By the time the PF Coupe came around in 1958, they had ramped up production and put in their first assembly line, so they were actually better capable of mass producing the cars. So when you think of an assembly line, nowadays you think of a bunch of machines and maybe a couple guys making sure everything's going right. But back in 1958, that was definitely not the case. They were still very much hand-built cars where you had an assembly line, but all the cars, each car had a guy doing whatever their job was, putting the doors on or the chrome on or interior, whatever their position was. And then they would roll the car by hand to the next guy for him to do his job. So it was very much hand built still. The PF Coupe, they only made 353 of them, which was their most mass-produced car at the time. But in today's numbers, it kind of makes me laugh because you think of something like the 575 Super America, which is considered a very limited production car nowadays, and they made 559 of the 575 Super America, which is limited production, but only 353 of the PF Coupe, which at that time was mass production. Of the 353 PF Coupes that were ever made, it's commonly thought that only about half of them still exist today. And there's a couple reasons for that. So first, some of them were crashed and destroyed over time, which does happen, but a lot of people did use these cars for replicas. Companies like Drogo, who made the Series 2 GTO bodies, took these cars, took the PF Coupes, and rebodied them into sports racers like the Series 2 GTOs. Well, many of them were used for that in period, and then over time, that tradition did continue. And there's a really good reason. The 250 PF Coupe is basically the perfect donor car for a very accurate, correct replica. If you want a GTO, SWB, California Spider replica, then this car has the right engine, chassis, components in order to make that replica for you. The 330s were used a lot for replicas, but you have cut the chassis and they do have a slightly different engine. So these were the perfect car for replicas, which is why there's probably less than 200 still in their original form today. I do want to mention a couple of the other famous rebodies that were done in period using the PF Coupe chassis. So I mentioned the Drogo body GTO, which was done in about 1964. Drogo did another one where he redid the body in a lightweight alloy and made a bunch of little cosmetic changes, extended the grille, a bunch of little things like that. There was also one done to look like a 250 Testarossa that was done by Fantuzzi. Tom Mead had a couple of them built. So he had one done into a Tomasima 3, which is a really cool car. It has gull wing doors. He had the Nimbo Spider and the Nimbo Coupe done out of a PF Coupe. So all of these cars that were done by notable people back in period when these cars were basically new have gained a lot of value today, and they hold a special place in history. Today, when these cars are used as replicas, they still hold a lot of value because it's all Ferrari components and it's all the right sizing and everything. But truthfully, this car in itself, the PF Coupe, is such a wonderful car that sometimes it's kind of sad to see them turned into something else, because they are something that can be appreciated as it is, and the replicas are amazing, but the PF Coupe in itself is an amazing car too. There were two different versions of the PF Coupe made, and not a lot of those variations were cosmetic, or basically none of the differences were cosmetic. It was all different mechanical things they did. In the engine, this is a Series 1 car, and Series 1 cars had the inside spark plug, they had all drum brakes, and a 4-speed transmission. And for the Series 2 cars, they changed those to an outside plug, so it's a bit easier to access the spark plugs when you need to change them. And for owners, not a big deal, but their mechanics definitely thanked them for that change. And then they also, the Series 2 cars, had disc brakes and a overdrive on the transmission, so basically like a 5th gear. A lot of people ask me nowadays, is the Ferrari matching numbers? When you have a car like a PF Coupe, then yes, back in this day, they had matching numbers. And what that means is there's a number stamping on the engine that will match the chassis number that's displayed on the data plate. So back in the 50s, and for a long time throughout Ferrari's history, when they made these cars, they would take a chassis, they would take an engine, and they would stamp them with the same number. This one is 1315, and you'll see the stamping in a couple different spots, and so it means the car is matching numbers. So if you took this engine and swapped it with a different car, it would no longer be matching numbers. That is actually kind of no longer relevant today, because around the time of the Dino and Daytona, Ferrari had ramped up production of their cars so much that they couldn't do matching numbers anymore. So they would take a chassis that already had a stamped chassis number, they'd take an engine that already had a stamped engine number, and put them together and note down which engine number went with which chassis. So the phrase, is it matching numbers, it still means the same kind of thing. Is the original engine still in the car? But it no longer, with more modern cars, means, is it matching numbers? Because it's not going to be matching numbers, even if it is the original engine in newer cars. I've always loved how comfortable the Ferraris of the 50s are. They're very luxurious and timeless and classy. You really feel that 50s class in them with the leather and the wood. And one of the nice design points they did is the shifter is right above the transmission, so it has really smooth shifting. But steering wheel on this car is quite massive compared to today's standards. But there's a very good reason they did that. If you look at the steering wheel and think of leverage, basically as a heavy car with no power steering, you want a big steering wheel in order to really give you that control and leverage over the car. Imagine if it was a lot smaller, it would be a lot more difficult to turn the car without power steering, which is why it has such a big steering wheel on it. And then another thing is all the little buttons on the dash. I do like how they have labeled all the buttons, because if it's not something that you've driven before and are used to, you're not gonna know what all the various little knobs and buttons do. Enzo Ferrari refused to compromise when it came to how he wanted his cars built. And what he wanted was performance over flair and glitz. And he definitely was doing something right, because cars of this era have become some of the most desirable, sought after, and expensive cars imaginable today. So I hope you guys have enjoyed this video and learned a little something about the 250 PF Coupe. If you like this, then please subscribe and stay tuned, because we got a lot more coming very soon.